The next steps involve pulling out or removing some of the coolant hoses. The first step in doing so is to drain the coolant. To drain off the coolant, use the flexible funnel VAS 6675. To better illustrate this process and aid orientation, we will show you the following steps using a selection of graphics. After draining the coolant, remove this double cable tie as well as this standard cable tie. Mark or make a note of their positions, as the coolant hoses need to be fixed in the same position when reassembling. First, the hose from the thermostat housing that leads to the coolant pipe is completely removed. Then the lower hose, which leads to the engine oil cooler, is released. Next, remove the small hose that leads to the generator cooling system. Then disconnect the hose that leads from the thermostat housing to the heat exchanger from its connection. Finally, the upper coolant hose must be pulled off. Please note, the upper hose clamp is difficult to reach. We will now show you an alternative method for accessing the upper hose clamp as chosen by us. In our alternative method, the coolant hose is removed together with the engine. To do this, pull off the branched hose that leads to the engine oil cooler and the lower end of the hose on the coolant pipe. The hose now needs to be threaded through and exposed in order to avoid any damage when the engine is removed. Any hoses that have become stuck are best released using removal wedge 3409. Do not use any sharp-edged tools that could damage the hoses, pipelines, or connections. Seal all the lines and connections using clean plugs. Next, disconnect this refrigerant line in the area of the transmission tunnel. The open ends must be carefully sealed in order to prevent moisture from entering the refrigerant circuit. This pipe hose assembly must also be loosened slightly upwards from the double clamp. To drain the engine oil, the 3 drain plugs on the engine must be removed. As this area is difficult to access, bit T40159 must be used. Once new seals have been attached, tighten the drain plugs again immediately, according to instructions. In order to later check the drain plugs for leaks, these areas are then cleaned very thoroughly. There is another drain plug on the oil reservoir. This is where the oil is drained. Also attach a new seal on this screw. Once again, thoroughly clean this area until everything is completely dry. Next, remove the pipe hose assemblies on the engine. After releasing these 2 screws, the retaining plate can be removed. Then, the pipe hose assemblies can be pulled out. Seal the lines and connections using clean plugs and protect the pipe nozzles against damage. Before removing the pipe hose assemblies on the bottom of the oil reservoir, first release the earth wire that leads from the gearbox to the body. Again, seal the pipe hose assemblies and the oil reservoir using clean plugs. Then, unscrew the 4 engine mounting screws.
Once the entire engine unit is removed, if the gearbox needs to be separated from the engine, the following screws and nuts should be unscrewed at this point.
Let's move on to the positive battery cable. Release the mounting points and guide the line upwards into the engine compartment. Release the refrigerant line from the drip tray and seal using a clean plug. This line must later be guided into the engine compartment. Caution: do not overstretch, fold or bend the refrigerant lines or refrigerant hoses. Next, remove the pipe hose assembly that leads from the oil cooler carrier to the oil reservoir. This line may have only little clearance from the reservoir, making it more difficult to remove the oil line. Please note, if you push the reservoir slightly upwards, you will have more clearance from the oil line. Doing so makes it easier to remove the line. First, mark the reservoir in order to ensure that it's returned to its original position during reassembly. Then, release the pipe hose assembly that leads from the oil cooler carrier to the oil reservoir. Caution: if these connections are dirty, these areas must first be cleaned thoroughly in order to ensure that no dirt enters the oil cooler carrier. At this point, engine oil escapes until the oil cooler and the lines are empty. First, clean up the engine oil using a cloth and then siphon the rest of the oil. Don't forget, seal the connection and the line using clean plugs. To remove the exhaust system, pull the vacuum lines off the adjustment elements for the exhaust flaps. As you can see, there are two slightly hidden screw positions inside the heat insulation. Unscrew these nuts. Then release the heat insulation for the exhaust system from the body in this area. While in this working position, remove the lower screws from the cross member on both sides. Then release the hydraulic line that leads to the power steering. Remove the retaining clip and release the threaded connection. Caution: make sure to counterhold in order to prevent damage to the lines. Again, seal the ends of the lines. Do not seal the lines like this. If adhesive tape is used, as shown here, the oil will dissolve the adhesive and the adhesive residue will enter the oil circuit, where it will cause considerable malfunction. Generally, if these adhesive residues are not removed completely, the line connection will leak. Cleaning paper is also unsuitable to seal lines. The use of cleaning paper carries the risk of leaving behind pieces of paper or fibers that could later lead to malfunctions. The best thing to use is a clean sealing plug, one that also protects the thread against dirt. On the other side, disconnect the gearbox oil lines from the temperature regulator. Then, the left and right drive shafts are released. Remove the screws from the joint. This means they are no longer in the way when taking out the engine. On vehicles with a secondary air pump in the rear right wheel housing, this must be removed or at least released in order to provide clearance to allow for the removal of this mounting screw on the exhaust system. To release the pump, remove the two outer screws and loosen the central screw. Doing so allows the secondary air pump to be moved far enough to the side to allow the mounting screw on the exhaust system to be removed. Next, release the two clamps on the silencer. The clamps may be very tight. Use a drift to precisely knock the clamps in order to loosen them. Please note, as the heat insulation passes very close to the light carrier when taking out the silencer, it is advantageous to first remove these speed nuts. Doing so allows for a bit more clearance and ensures that the heat insulation will not get caught in the speed nuts. The 4 securing bolts on the silencer are then removed and the silencer is taken out. Caution: after taking out the silencer, check all heat shields for damage. Also, check that all the connections and fixings are seated securely. Damaged or missing parts must be replaced. Next, remove the anti-roll bar. Then, disconnect the vacuum hose that leads to the brake servo from the engine at the point shown here. Next, release the fuel supply line from the fuel rail. Caution: when releasing the union nut, it is essential that you counterhold the fuel rail. If you do not do this, there is a risk of the soldered connection on the fuel rail being damaged and leaking as a result. Again, seal the 2 connections correctly. The crankcase breather can now be exposed and disconnected from the oil reservoir. Next, expose the wiring harness under the side panel and the vacuum lines for the exhaust flaps. At this point, also remove the vacuum reservoir for the exhaust flap control unit. Then, pull off this secondary air hose and expose the breather to the R8 expansion tank. Then, pull off the connector on the oil level and oil temperature sender. The line is secured with a clip in this location. This fixing must also be released. The secondary air pump in the front left of the engine compartment is removed next. Pull off the 2 boots of the air intake. Then remove the power steering reservoir and release the oil reservoir from the cross member. Then remove the cross member. The cross member is screwed onto the body in 4 places. Caution: spacer plates ensure stress-free assembly at the fixing points. The spacer plates must be refitted at the same positions during installation. For this reason, when releasing the screws, ensure that the spacer plates do not fall out and identify them according to their fitting location. The next step is to remove the oil reservoir. The coolant expansion tank and its bracket are detached. Now the engine gearbox wiring harness in the engine compartment is exposed. First, release the earth wires on the left and right next to the engine control units. The engine control units are released from their brackets but remain on the wiring harness. For the next step, protect the intake manifold using a large flexible rubber mat. The engine control units can then be placed on the intake manifold without scratching it. Then, the wiring harness is fed from the vehicle interior into the engine compartment. When threading through the engine partition, take particular care that no cables or plugs are damaged. Please note, if the breather line is pulled off the fuel filler neck, as shown here, you will have enough space to receive the wiring harness. The complete wiring harness is carefully bundled and also placed on the intake manifold. If necessary, the wiring harness can be fixed in this location. Expose and pull off the vacuum hose that leads to the activated charcoal filter. Release the threaded connection for the gearbox mounting. Next, remove the bracket for the connector of the clutch position sender and place this to one side. In its place, mount the fixture T40137. Before mounting the lifting tackles to lift out the engine, once again ensure that all the connections to the engine and to the gearbox have been disconnected. The lifting tackles must be fitted in such a way that allows the engine and the gearbox to be lifted as evenly and horizontally as possible. Use the illustrations in the workshop manual to adjust the lifting tackles. Secure the hooks and bolts at the designated positions using cotter pins. Take one last look at the engine compartment. Is everything disconnected? If yes, the engine can be lifted out. Carefully raise the engine unit and slowly lift it out. At all times, make sure that no lines, cables, heat shields or other parts are damaged. Caution: the engine unit must not be placed on the engine's oil pan. If the engine unit is to be dismantled further, place it on the scissor-type assembly platform VAS 6131. If this is not necessary, ensure that the engine unit is positioned correctly. Correctly storing the dismantled parts is just as important as working on them carefully. The container for removed parts VAG 1698A and the storage compartment VAS 6760 help to keep things in order and to store the parts without damaging them. A structured method for storing screws is particularly helpful when it comes to assembly. Caution: finally, a very important piece of information. If the engine needs to be replaced due to engine damage, check very carefully whether metal splinters or particles are present in the engine oil, or in the oil-carrying components. Due to the dry sump lubrication, the engine oil circuit consists of a few components that are positioned away from the engine. Shown here is the engine oil circuit to the V8 engine, which is positioned away from the engine. The oil reservoir and the engine cooler, a coolant oil heat exchanger, and the corresponding pipe hose assemblies. On the V10 engine, the engine oil cooler is an air oil heat exchanger fitted with a temperature regulator. To prevent any consequential damage, it must be ensured that no impurities enter the oil circuit of the new engine. If large quantities of metal splinters or particles are found, the pipe hose assemblies, the oil reservoir and the engine oil cooler must also be replaced.
In general, the engine is reinstalled in reverse sequence. However, there are a few specific pieces of information that need to be noted. We will demonstrate this process to you in a later program.
Caution. This film does not replace the current workshop manual and other service literature. This documentation should take priority at all times. We always want to improve our programs. Please send any suggestions, improvements and suggested topics you may have to audi.service.tv@audi.de.